In the middle of the 1950s, American and British intelligence dug a tunnel under the most dangerous border on Earth. It ran for almost a quarter of a mile, from the western half of Berlin, beneath the line that split the city in two, and out under a cemetery on the Soviet side. At the far end, in a sealed chamber packed with amplifiers and tape machines, they reached up and tapped the cables carrying the Soviet military's own phone calls and telegrams. It was the biggest wiretap anyone had ever attempted, and the whole thing had been betrayed to the Soviets before the first shovel ever touched the ground. This is the story of Operation Gold, and what we know about it rests on the declassified record, the CIA's own internal history of the operation, written in secret in the 1960s and released decades later, alongside a companion history from the National Security Agency. Two intelligence services, looking back at their own work, and not always agreeing on what it was worth. To understand why anyone would dig a tunnel under a hostile army, you have to understand what Berlin was in those years. The city sat deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the city itself was divided, west and east, between the former allies who were now turning into enemies. That made West Berlin a strange island, a piece of the Western world surrounded by the Eastern Bloc, and it made the city the single best listening post in the Cold War. The cables running under East Berlin were a junction box for Soviet communications, carrying traffic between Moscow and its forces across Eastern Europe. The problem was the same one that haunted Western intelligence everywhere in this period. The Soviet Union was a closed world. You could not simply ask how many divisions the Red Army had in Germany, or what its commanders were planning, or where its nuclear forces stood. The most important facts were locked behind a border, and the not knowing was its own kind of danger. Because a government that cannot see its rival will tend to imagine the worst and arm against it. But there was a precedent that suggested a way in. A few years earlier, in Vienna, British intelligence had run an operation codenamed Silver. Vienna, like Berlin, was an occupied city carved into sectors, and the British had quietly tunneled from a building in their zone to tap Soviet landlines running through the city. Silver worked. It proved that if you could physically reach the right cables, you could listen to an adversary who thought he was speaking in complete privacy. The lesson of Vienna was simple and tempting. Do it again, somewhere it would matter even more. Berlin was where it would matter more. And so the two services made a bargain. The Americans had money and they had the better access because the most promising tap point sat just across the border from the American sector. The British had the experience from Vienna, the craft of actually splicing into a live cable without anyone noticing. So the deal divided the work. The United States would pay for the operation and dig the tunnel. The British would do the delicate business of the taps. The man the CIA put in charge of its Berlin base was a figure who could have walked out of a spy novel, except that the real version was stranger and rougher than fiction. His name was William King Harvey. He had started at the FBI, fallen out badly with its director, J. Edgar Hoover, and moved to the young CIA, where his talent for the hard and suspicious side of the work found a home. Harvey carried a pistol at all times. He had a reputation for drink and for a kind of relentless, paranoid sharpness. And that sharpness had already paid off once, when he was among the first to put his suspicions in writing about a charming British liaison officer named Kim Philby, who would later be exposed as one of the most damaging Soviet moles of the century. In Berlin, Harvey ran the tunnel. The men working it took to calling the place Harvey's Hole. The engineering was a feat in its own right. The plan was to sink a shaft inside a building the Americans put up in their sector, a warehouse explained away as a radar station, and then dig out horizontally, under the border, to a point beneath a road on the Soviet side where the target cables ran. The tunnel had to run for roughly 1,500 feet, about the height of the Empire State Building laid on its side. It had to be dug without the spoil, the removed earth, becoming visible and giving the game away. It had to be lined, climate-controlled, and kept dry. And at the far end, the diggers had to come up underneath cables buried beside a busy road, install the taps, and do it all without a sound reaching the surface, where East German police walked a beat a few feet overhead. Every part of it fought back. The dirt alone was a problem, because you cannot dig a quarter-mile tunnel without producing tons of spoil, and that spoil could not be trucked away without somebody noticing a warehouse that endlessly shipped out earth. So the diggers stored it, packing the removed soil into the basement of their fake radar station, hiding the evidence of the hole inside the building that hid the hole. The water table was high, and the ground was wet, and the tunnel had to be sealed and pumped to keep from flooding. And then there was the heat. All the electronics at the tap end, the amplifiers and recorders running around the clock, threw off warmth, and that warmth rose through the earth toward the surface. In cold weather, the planners realized it could melt the frost in a long, thin line across the ground directly above the tunnel, drawing a glowing arrow on the landscape pointing straight at their secret. So they had to install refrigeration underground, cooling the tunnel so that its own waste heat would not betray it from above. Every solution they invented was a defense against being seen. They pulled it off. The tunnel reached the cables. The taps went on, and the take began to flow. A torrent of Soviet and East German military and intelligence communications, recorded onto tape and flown back for translation and analysis. By the measure of pure access, it was a triumph. The West was now sitting inside the enemy's phone system, except that it was not a secret. It had never been a secret. And here is where the story turns from a heist into a tragedy. Back in the planning stage, before the digging began, the operation had been worked out in a series of meetings in London at a quiet address called No. 2 Carlton Gardens. The planners kept the circle tight. They deliberately excluded the West German service on the grounds that it was too penetrated by Soviet agents to trust. But there was a man in the room they did trust completely, and should not have. He was a British intelligence officer named George Blake. Blake had been a prisoner during the Korean War, held by the communists, and somewhere in that captivity he had changed sides and agreed to work for the Soviets. To his colleagues in British intelligence, he was a capable, polite, hard-working officer. To the KGB, he was one of the most valuable assets they had ever run, with a code name that translates as Diamond. And George Blake sat in those planning meetings and took notes. And everything he learned about the tunnel, the location, the purpose, the method, he handed to his Soviet handlers. The KGB knew about Operation Gold before a single spadeful of Berlin clay had been turned. Now think about the position that put the Soviets in, because their response is the most revealing thing in the entire affair. They had a choice. They could roll up the tunnel before it ever opened, expose the Western plot, and score an easy propaganda victory. Or they could do nothing, let the enemy spend its money and dig its hole, and listen to Soviet communications and protect the source who had told them about it. They chose to protect the source. The intelligence they could lose by letting the tunnel run was, in their judgment, less precious than George Blake. If they shut the tunnel down too early or too neatly, the Americans and British would know they had a leak, and the hunt for that leak might lead back to Blake. So the KGB made a cold and disciplined decision. They let it run. And here the record corrects a story you might expect. You might assume that knowing about the tap, the Soviets flooded it with lies, turning the tunnel into a channel for feeding false information to the West. According to the CIA's own later assessment, that is not what happened. The agency found no evidence of a deliberate disinformation campaign through the cables. The Soviet military kept using the lines for real communications. The knowledge of the tap was held so closely on the Soviet side to protect Blake that the ordinary officers using those phones had no idea anyone was listening. To deceive the West through the cables, the KGB would have had to widen the circle of people who knew, and widening the circle put Blake at risk. So they kept the secret even from their own users, and the traffic that flowed into Harvey's hole was, by the best Western judgment, genuine. That is the strange knot at the center of Operation Gold. The Soviets knew, but because they had to protect the man who told them, they could not act on what they knew without giving him away. So the tunnel betrayed before construction still delivered real intelligence, because the betrayal was a secret the betrayed were not allowed to use. It ran that way for 11 months and 11 days. And then, in the spring of 1956, the KGB engineered its exit. The cover story they needed was handed to them by the weather. It had been an unusually wet season, and water had gotten into one of the cables and degraded it, exactly the kind of fault that would naturally call for a repair crew. So Soviet and East German signal troops went out to the spot, dug down to the failing cable, and discovered, with a great show of surprise, that it had been tapped and rerouted into a tunnel running back toward the western sector. The discovery looked like an accident. It was anything but. It was a carefully timed performance that let the Soviets close the operation down without ever hinting that they had known about it for years. Then the Soviets tried to turn the discovery into propaganda, and this part did not go the way they planned. They brought reporters down into the tunnel. They pointed to the equipment and the wiring and called it a gangster act, a violation of international law, a crime of the imperialist powers. But the world's newspapers looked at the photographs of this immaculate, lined, climate-controlled tunnel reaching deep under the border, and many of them did not see a crime. They saw audacity. They saw engineering. The story that was supposed to embarrass the West instead made the tunnel famous and made the men who built it look like the boldest operators of the age. Behind the headlines, the quieter work went on for years. The tunnel had generated an enormous archive, something on the order of 50,000 reels of recorded tape. Translating and analyzing that mountain of material took more than 2 years after the tunnel itself had gone dark. The pictures stopped, but the listening, in a sense, continued long afterward, as analysts worked through everything the cables had carried. And this is where the two intelligence services that wrote the histories begin to disagree. The CIA, looking back, judged Operation Gold a success. The take had been real, it had not been poisoned with lies, and it had given Western policymakers and military planners a genuine window into Soviet forces in Germany at a tense moment. The agency was proud of it. The National Security Agency, which handled much of the signals work, was more reserved in its own internal history, less convinced that the flood of intercepted communications had been worth quite as much as the CIA believed. It is a small disagreement, but a telling one, because it shows even the insiders arguing over the value of a secret that cost so much to obtain. The final piece of the truth did not arrive until years later. George Blake kept working as a Soviet agent until 1961, when other evidence finally exposed him. He was brought back to London, confessed, and was convicted of passing secrets to the Soviet Union. Only then, with Blake unmasked, did Western intelligence fully understand what had happened to the tunnel. It had not been lost to a rainy spring and a lucky repair crew. It had been compromised from the very first meeting, years before the digging began. The accident had been a story, and the real explanation had been sitting in the planning room the whole time, taking notes. Blake was sentenced to a long prison term, and in a final twist worthy of the rest of the tale, he later escaped from a British prison and surfaced in Moscow, where he lived out his life as a guest of the country he had served in secret. So what do we make of Operation Gold when we lay the legend beside the record? The legend, the version that ran in the papers in 1956, was a simple one. Brilliant Western spies dug an incredible tunnel, listened to the Soviets for a year, and were undone by bad luck when the East Germans stumbled onto it. The record tells a deeper and stranger story. The tunnel was betrayed before it was built. The luck was manufactured, and the betrayal was so valuable to the Soviets that they could not afford to use it, which is the only reason the tunnel produced anything real at all. There is a lesson in that about how secrets actually behave, and it runs all through these files. The deniability that intelligence services prize so highly is a blade with two edges. The same secrecy that let the West hide a tunnel under the enemy's feet also let the enemy hide that he had known about it from the start. Each side concealed something from the other, and concealed it so well that the truth took decades and a stack of declassified documents to assemble. What the documents finally show is not a clean victory or a clean defeat, but something more human and more useful. A magnificent piece of work, built on a foundation that had already been sold to the other side, that still managed to matter, because betrayal and value in the strange arithmetic of espionage are not always opposites. The tunnel is gone now, filled in and built over, but the history is open. You can read the CIA's own account of how it dug its greatest wiretap, and how it learned, years too late, that the other side had been in the room the whole time. Read it yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.